Hello, and welcome to the School Safety Free Period podcast. I'm Dr. Amy Klinger, and I'm flying solo today. Typically, we are privileged to have Amanda here, and the two of us have some discussions about what's happening in the world of school safety in a much more informal, sort of interactive sort of way. But luckily, Amanda is on leave with a new baby, and so I will wait with the rest of those kind of announcements and let her do that. But we're thrilled that she can't be here because she's got much more exciting things happening in her life right now. So I'm going to forge on alone and talk a little bit about some of the things that have been happening this past spring as we close out a school year. What I want to talk about today is, I guess, the duty of care, if you will. I'm talking about vulnerable populations and school safety, because this is an area that oftentimes really sort of gets ignored in the hustle and bustle of trying to be reactive and trying to, sort of generally look at school safety. Well, this was an incident that happened this spring in Missouri with a student who is on the autism spectrum and is nonverbal. And so the school has this student on, he has the ability to have an aide. So he has a one-on-one aide and is, afforded special education needs appropriate to his particular needs. And in this case, the mom discovered, to her dismay and horror, I'm sure, that her son at school had been eating large amounts of gravel. And this was found when she took him to the emergency room, and an x-ray revealed that there was pea gravel throughout his intestinal tract. Now, this is a 9-year-old nonverbal special education student who clearly, in probably anyone's estimation, is probably a bit more vulnerable and also perhaps needs a higher standard of attention and care than a more typical peer. So the mother contacted the school district. They did an investigation and found in the surveillance video of the playground that her son had in fact been eating this gravel. And the aide at one time does pull something out of his mouth. And she was with him the entire time on the playground, but apparently either did not notice or did not respond to him eating a lot of gravel throughout this time. And in the statement, which as part of the investigation, when they spoke with the aide, she talked about how, according to her statement, that the normal aide, the aide that normally works with this student, and the student's teacher were asleep in the classroom when she went to pick him up to take him out to recess. And that it wasn't the first time that she had found them to be asleep. So it's kind of interesting that you have this one sort of allegation that then led to, as part of the investigation, other allegations. And it really sort of points out that just because no one has, quote unquote, said something, doesn't mean that we may not potentially have, that we may very well have some of these issues going on in our schools. And it really speaks to the need for a higher level of both supervision as well as accountability, and really sort of paying attention to what might be happening in situations where students cannot advocate for themselves, either because of their age or because of the nature of their disability or because of the nature of the situation that, and we could, discuss that that's really in many cases could be all the way up elementary, all the way up through middle school, where students can't report that or don't feel comfortable reporting it. But I think in these particular cases, when you have really vulnerable populations, as the mom is quoted in the article, the hard part is my son is non-speaking, so he can't tell me. This is what we know, but what do we not know? And I think that's really something that we have to start paying a little more attention to and really considering the idea of what is happening in these potential areas related to school safety that we don't know. And oftentimes, the daily practices lend itself to being unaware. We have classroom doors that are covered. We have doors that are shut all the time. We don't maybe have a lot of interaction where there's no one going in and out. So you're not really seeing what's happening on a daily basis with these students or on an ongoing basis. So it's really incumbent upon everyone, school stakeholder-wise, to really kind of pay attention and think about these vulnerable populations. Kind of a different example of this occurred in Florida, where you had a situation where a pre-kindergarten teacher was accused of taping a five-year-old's mouth shut because the student wouldn't stop talking. So she pulls out a roll of tape, puts it over the student's mouth. She did send a message home and apologized. It won't happen again. But the student asked for it because they wouldn't be quiet, and it really raises, clearly this is a vulnerable population, and it is not of the same level of severity as a health crisis, in the previous example. But it really does speak to what may be happening to students who are vulnerable either because of their special needs or because of their age, and what may be happening to them that we are unaware of. And if we don't have any kind of checks and balances and accountability and oversight, we really leave ourselves open. The school really leaves themselves open to allegations that may or may not be accurate. And, again, in this particular case, I guess we can all think of, the frustration or feel the frustration of, a child that won't behave the way that we think they should. But then, you sort of cross this line into who thinks this is a good idea. And at what point do you go, yeah, this is good. This is fine. This is an appropriate response that is grounded in best practices. Clearly not. And so I think that one sort of shows the other end of the spectrum where it may not be as potentially deadly or potentially harmful, but yet you get into this idea of what kind of an environment, climate, and culture are these students in if the classroom management or the response to a problem crosses this line. And if it crosses this line in one area, where else might that be an issue? And so I think it's really important for us as supervisors, people that are in leadership positions, supervisors, principals, those sort of things, to be vigilant to that and to be paying attention and not waiting for, if something was wrong, I'm sure I would know, sort of a thing. Instead, being more proactive, which is kind of, you could apply that generally of we oftentimes in schools, we're waiting for something to happen. And then we sort of react and go, oh no, now we're going to scramble to try to fix this, as opposed to what can we observe or notice or see, and what's, our gut telling us doesn't seem quite right, or what students are disclosing, maybe not in a very overt way. All of those things sort of funnel into that duty of care. And that's kind of the overarching question that I want to raise today is, what is our duty of care as educators, as staff members, as professionals, as parents, what is our duty of care, in particular to vulnerable populations? Now, there's lots of other issues associated with this in school safety in terms of, and we hear this a lot in the work that we do of, we have a student with special needs. How are we going to rapidly evacuate? How are we going to respond to a crisis event with them? And, oftentimes we talk with special education teachers about this, of it may not be pretty, and it may not be in keeping with what we wish would happen on a regular basis, but that doesn't excuse us from having to have the ability to respond. We need to be able to rapidly evacuate these students. We need to be able to shelter them from whatever this thing is, whether it's, a severe weather event, a fire alarm, an intruder, whatever those things are. And so we have to deal with the reality of this particular vulnerable population it's going to be more traumatic. It's going to be more difficult. We're going to need to think about it differently. We're going to need to practice more. We're going to need to anticipate more. We're going to need to maybe have more resources and more assistance. But we have to think about those things in advance, knowing full well that these vulnerable populations are in our schools, and we have a duty of care to them, just like we do to every other student, to be able to protect and respond and be proactive. And so I think that is oftentimes when schools are so far behind that they're playing catch up all the time and they're just being reactive, they never get to the point of being proactive. And when they do get to the point of being proactive, they're thinking about the general population and saying, okay, well, this would work for most students. Great. Then we also have to make sure that we get to the step where we are saying, and what are we going to do? And it's that and what are we going to do for these particular vulnerable populations? And oftentimes it comes down to some very basic things. Number one is supervision, always having a higher level, better supervision. Also having the pre-planning, looking at the sort of what ifs, response kind of planning. And then some of it is what we've been talking about so far in this podcast, is that higher level of vigilance, of paying attention, of anticipating, of thinking about what could go wrong here. And that is a really critical skill. Not that you're going to be anxious and hypervigilant and in a constant state of panic, but rather in a fairly, sort of calm, rational sense of, what would we do if we had to move quickly out of this room with this population? What would we do if something happened out of the ordinary in a population that is very much ingrained into their routines? So it's really sort of looking at the impact of these potential things on this population that is more vulnerable than perhaps the rest of the school based on their age, their developmental status, their disability, a lot of those different things. So I really encourage you to take a little bit of a critical look at what are we able to do currently and what are we preparing or thinking about to be able to do for these populations, especially as we wrap up one school year and start to look at another one. This is a good time to really start to make some changes in your policies, your procedures, get some training, have some conversations when you can be pretty calm and it's not in the middle of the event, but you're rather doing an anticipatory sort of discussion. So I think that's an incredible way to really start looking at what can we do to really meet that duty of care that we have for vulnerable populations. So stay in touch with us. I know this is not quite as exciting as when Amanda and I are here together to banter about, but I think some of these things may be worth reflecting on as you wrap up a school year. So until next time, thank you for joining us.